Hey there again, listeners and fellow learners. Welcome once again to our Namcol radio studio. My name is Ronald Krotz. Listeners, in lesson 1 today, we're going to talk about how to interpret cartoons and images. Today, we'll listen to a teacher and his learners who will explain the interpretation of cartoons and images. They will look at, when interpreting a cartoon or an image, what is essential to look at. Enjoy the lesson with us. Good day, class. Today we'll focus on how to interpret cartoons and images. Let's see what you know. Debbie, when you look at a cartoon, and in your opinion, what is important?
I think it's important to look at what historical event it refers to.
Yes. Esther, why is the date important?
It can tell us when the event took place, sir.
Okay. What will be the purpose of people in a cartoon? Esther?
It will tell us who they represent. For example, whether they represent the British, capitalists, or so on.
Okay. If you see a symbol in a cartoon, what can that tell you?
It can tell me what the person represents. For example, the hammer and sickle represent communism and the swastika, the Nazis.
Okay. The action that is shown in a cartoon, does it have any meaning?
Yes, it can tell us what's happening in the cartoon.
Esther, if you think about our previous lessons, why is a caption important?
So if I remember correctly, it tells us from where the source is coming from. That includes the date and the audience.
Okay, Debbie, what can you add?
I think I will look at the message or the meaning of the cartoon.
Very good. Yes, when looking for the meaning, you must look at the cartoonist's attitude towards an event. In other words, what does the cartoonist think about what has happened? You need to look at the cartoonist's use of humor. Also, it is important to know that the cartoonist usually makes fun of or criticizes an issue or a person. Let's summarize. Primary sources date back to the actual time in the past when an event occurred. They are primary sources because they are based on what people saw or heard or created at the time. Primary sources could be letters, documents, books, photographs, and drawings. Now, secondary sources, they are usually, but not always, produced at some time after the event or period that they describe. Textbooks are typical examples of secondary sources. It is not always easy to determine whether a source is primary or secondary. A cartoon, for example, can be seen as both. The cartoonist was unlikely to have witnessed an event, so in that case, you might consider it to be a secondary source. However, as it was created at the time of the event, it could also be considered a primary source, as it reflects what people at the time thought about an event. How to analyze and interpret cartoons. A cartoon is a drawing that makes a particular point, very often by using humor or satire. A political cartoon usually highlights an absurdity, makes fun of or criticizes a personality or an issue that is currently in the news. Step 1. Place the cartoon in its historical context. To what historical event does the cartoon refer? That's the first thing that you have to look at. Secondly, when did the event take place? Then the date of the cartoon will help you to answer this question. Date can be a year, month, or specific date of the cartoon publication. And then lastly, where was the cartoon published? That's the first step. Step 2, identify and explain the important elements in the cartoon. Then you have to look at the people in the cartoon and who they represent. Also, any symbols or objects which may appear in the cartoon. Then, the action that is shown in the cartoon. Also, the caption of the cartoon, if there is one. Step 3. Then you identify the message of the cartoon. First, look at the cartoonist's humor. It is important to remember that the cartoonist usually makes fun of or criticizes an issue or a person. The cartoon is not a neutral representation of an issue. Listeners, we have heard things like, you will usually be asked what the cartoonist's attitude is towards an event. For example, what does the cartoonist think about what has happened? You need to look at cartoons very carefully and be able to interpret it. Say, for example, the cartoonist asks about newspaper. Which newspaper? This gives a clue to the attitude. For example, Germans, British, Namibian, Russian, or the USA. What is written there on the cartoon? Either the caption or information on the cartoon. The date is very important. If this is not on the cartoon, it should be above it in the setting of the context. The examiners will give you the date or the name, the figures in the cartoon. They tell you which event the cartoon refers to. Then, using photographs. Although a photograph is usually taken by an eyewitness, you cannot be certain that the photograph is an accurate reflection of what happened. Photographers have a purpose in mind when they take a photograph. You need to ask what that purpose was. Sometimes photographs are altered to improve the appearance of people. For example, Stalin. Parts of a photograph can be blocked out, like Trotsky, or a photograph can even be fake. Is this a reliable source? That is the question. This question is asking you whether the source is accurate or can be trusted. A source may be reliable for some purposes, but unreliable for others. There are a number of questions that should be asked of the source before you answer this question. What are the questions that you must ask? Who produced the source and when? Is the source biased in any way? Also, was the person who created the source an eyewitness? Also, was the source created a long time after the event? Why was the source produced? Are there any factual errors? A cartoon may be unreliable in telling you the facts about an event at the time that it happened, using your own knowledge. These questions should not be asked very often, as the way you answer the questions will show whether or not you have a good knowledge of the period, for example, of events leading to the Second World War. However, you may be asked to use the evidence in a source and your own knowledge to explain your answer, in which case you have the opportunity to show what you know about the event and say what has not been covered by the sources. However, you must also refer to the information in the sources. And that brings us to the end of today's presentation. From me, Ronald Krotz, program developer Yul van Harte, and the Namcol production crew. Thanks for listening, and until next time, take care.
This program was brought to you by Namcol with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.
Hi there, listeners and fellow learners. Welcome once again to our Namcol radio studio. My name is Ronald Krotz. Listeners, in lesson 2 today, we're going to talk about the testing of the reliability of sources, written sources as well as cartoons, and explain by using examples when and where they are appropriate. There are 3 main steps to test the reliability of a source. First, we look at the author, from where the source is coming from, and the intentions to write or produce it. Secondly, the date and the reasons why that specific date. Thirdly, the audience, reasons why that specific audience was chosen. Alright, let's keep the example of testing of reliability and then listen to today's lesson and see how we can apply it in class. Good morning, class.
Good morning, sir. Sir, I'm so angry. Someone stole my book. I think Esther stole my book.
Who took Debbie's book?
Sorry, Debbie. I took your book when you went to the toilet. I just wanted to compare my notes with yours.
Oh, okay, Natty. Esther, I'm sorry for accusing you, but you know you never make it easy for me.
Debbie, you know what? It's fine. But next time, don't just jump the gun before you accuse me. Make sure next time before you accuse anyone, please.
Okay, I agree totally. And with that, it will bring me to today's lesson, the testing of reliability of sources. Okay, reliability has to do with trust. In other words, we have to see if we can trust a source by performing some test on it.
Yes, sir. And if we test the reliability, does that mean that the character of the writer must be tested?
Yes, Debbie. You accuse Esther because she played tricks on you before. What else did you consider before you accuse her?
I accused her because, you know, she's always teasing and pulling some tricks on me and other people.
Yes. Now, in terms of historical sources, the first step to test if you can trust a source is to look at the provenance of the source.
So what is the meaning of provenance?
Okay. Provenance is the origin of the source or from where the source is coming from. In this case, it's the author or writer who's responsible for the creation or publishing of a source.
And what do we have to keep in mind when it comes to the author, sir?
One looks at the country of origin of the author, where the author is coming from. For example, from Britain, from Russia, America, is he a priest, and so on. Why did he or she produce a source? What do you think must we find out about an author's motives for producing a written source or a cartoon?
So, do I understand correctly that if I know where he or she is coming from, I'll be able to determine why he or she writes about that particular event? For example, if he or she is a German writing bad about the Weimar Republic, then you should know that Germans never liked democracy.
Smart girl, very smart. I like that. You must also consider the period of time certain things or events took place. For example, if a German is talking bad about the Weimar Republic during 1924, the time of the Dawes Plan, the German economy was flourishing and they just wanted to make people hate the government. Both sides will produce sources, written or cartoons or photographs to criticize the other one's actions.
So, is the date in a source very important?
Well, the date gives us the time when the source was produced or published. The author produces a source during a certain period to make people's feelings known or to reach a certain goal. If you look at the Treaty of Versailles in 1990 up to 1923, the British published sources about the Germans in an angry manner. But in the 1930s, before World War II, the tone was more appeasing.
Tone? Sir, can you please elaborate more on the tone?
A tone is the general character or attitude of a place, a piece of writing, a situation, and so on. One can easily depict skepticism, anger, happiness, or sarcasm from a source.
Sir, do I understand correctly? The date must be accompanied with reasons for producing the source at the specific time, and must I do research on the date to answer the question?
Correct. You must use your contextual knowledge, that is your own knowledge, to clear events surrounding the dates. However, you must keep in mind that the source has limitations. For example, the source stated April 1945, but it's not specific when in 1945. You must be able to point it out.
Sir, I read that an audience is also important when testing the reliability of a source. Can you please explain this to me?
Debbie, for example, if you has a quarrel with Esther, will you take revenge by telling her what you'll do, or will you rather confide in someone else?
I will definitely confide in someone else because Esther might plan to stop me in my tracks and it will be much safer to talk to someone else. You know, Esther might hit me or take some form of revenge.
Yes, you are correct. Let me give you some examples. The audience is the people who are listening to the author or the speaker, or the persons who are going to read a newspaper article or a book. Keep in mind, the author or speaker will only publish or speak in a safe environment. Hitler would not say in public that he was against the church because he might anger his own people and therefore lose support. He would rather do it in private because he spoke to people he could trust and it is safe. The communist Germans would criticize Hitler in France because it is safe to do so there. Firstly, because France was an enemy of Germany. And secondly, if they criticize him in Germany, they might have faced death or would be sent to a concentration camp. Listeners, let's recap today's lesson. Let's summarize. Reliability means how much we can believe or trust the source, or how accurate or dependable a source is. Who produced the source and why? When was the source produced? Why then? Is the source biased in any way? Was the person who created the source an eyewitness? Was the source created a long time after the event? Why was the source produced? Are there any factual errors? Who was the intended audience? Why that specific audience? Then you look at the time period. When did the events occur and the impact of it? Make use of your contextual or own knowledge to question events or sources to prove they are reliable. Look at the writer or the author. Was it Namibian, French, British, German, Russian, American, and so on? So it must be biased. Check for clues in pictures or words, the circumstances in which the sources was produced. Then you look at the information. Is it official? Is it unofficial, private, or public? Please keep the audience or the people who the message is directed to in mind. Compare or cross-reference your evidence in the sources, even with other sources in the question paper. The tone or language and words of the message can help you. For instance, sarcastic, sympathetic, and critical. Is the information reliable for the specific time period? Or recent information can be reliable or unreliable. Information in hindsight or looking back at past events can be in question because of the difference in time. For example, information by a historian or history textbook many years later. The type of source. An election poster can be connected to propaganda, information which gives a one-sided view of events either by careful selection, exaggeration, or deliberate untruth, which are designed to generate support for one side in a conflict or quarrel or competition. A cartoon, you focus on its origin and purpose. Then a photo, all may be true, but not necessarily. A diary, notes in the diary, not necessarily true. It could be fantasy, or it could also be true because it's private, a secret for a good reason. Statistics, where does it come from? What's the purpose? Memoirs, normally people justify themselves. Historian, the purpose for writing. A vicar or priest or pope always have to tell the truth, but they are also human. Eyewitnesses, different view, they can exaggerate to impress people or to make a point. And with that, we've come to the end of today's presentation. From me, Ronald Krotz, Program Developer Yul van Harte, and the Namcol production crew. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, take care.
This program was brought to you by NAMCOL with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.
Hi there again, listeners and fellow learners. Welcome once again to our NAMCOL radio studio. My name is Ronald Krotz. Listeners, in lesson 3 today, we are going to talk about evaluating sources. How reliable is the source? How useful is the source? Is one source more reliable or more useful than another? How far does this source explain why a certain event happened? Are you surprised by the source? Can you trust the source? Those are the questions that we are going to answer today. Remember, you must listen attentively to obtain the necessary skills to answer paper 2 better. Good. Let's look at the evaluation of sources. When looking at evaluating sources, you look at the following questions. 1. How reliable is the source? 2. How useful is the source? 3. Is one source more reliable or more useful than another? 4. How far does the source explain why a specific event happened? 5. Are you surprised by the source? 6. How would X have reacted to the source? 7. Who wrote the source? And 8. Why do these two sources differ? Good. Right. Please give me synonyms for reliable.
Sir, I think reliable relates to whether something is trustworthy, whether it is true, or whether it is dependable. Or you can also ask whether you believe what it says.
True. When you answer the reliable question, you must provide a balanced answer by addressing reliable and unreliable. What does the source tell you about the past? Does the source contain reference to people and events, words and phrases that you learned about? Where did the source originate? Can the source be trusted? If the origin of the source is unknown, it doesn't necessarily mean that the source can't be trusted. Newspaper articles and reports are often written by anonymous writers. Is there any statement or clue to show that the source is actually based on the writer's own experience or on the events that he or she witnessed? In other words, was the writer in a good position to say what happened? If the source was written a long time after the event, is there any reason to doubt the accuracy of the facts recalled by the writer? Is it a primary or a secondary source? Was there any particular reason why the source was written? For example, to justify the writer's action. Are the facts in the source supported by facts you know about from other historical sources?
Sir, can you tell me what the key ingredient is that one must consider when answering the useful question?
Okay, you ask yourself, useful for what? In other words, what is the purpose of the source? Keep in mind, no source is useless.
And what do we need to consider when looking at the surprise question?
Okay, you look at what in the source is shocking or not shocking you. Keep in mind, people don't feel and think the same about something. What is surprising you is what is unobvious and not surprising is the obvious one. You need to consider both sides. Listeners, that brings us to the end of today's presentation. Good. We have listened to things like, if a source is biased, It may not be useful if you are trying to find out about an event. However, the same source might be useful in showing how people felt at the time. A historical map might be useful because of the information on it. An election table is useful for giving the election results and showing which parties people supported, etc. The sources will never provide enough evidence about an event, thus make it less useful. Therefore, you need to use your own knowledge to discuss the usefulness of the source and to point out what has not been covered by the sources. But your knowledge should be directed to what is being required, however, not too much. When it comes to usefulness, you need to ask yourself what is the purpose of the sources, and in other words, useful for what? Thank you so much. From me, Ronald Krotz, Program Developer Yul van Harte, and the Namcall production crew, thanks again for listening. Until next time, take care.
This program was brought to you by Namcall with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.
Hi there again, listeners and fellow learners. Welcome once again to our Namcall radio studio. My name is Ronald Krotz. Listeners, in lesson 4 today, we are going to talk about the interpreting of sources. What does the source tell us about? What is the message of the source? What can you learn from the source? How far do these two sources agree? Right, today I want to talk about interpretation of sources. There are 3 things that I want you to remember about sources. The first thing, sources must speak to learners. Secondly, sources must have things to do in them. Thirdly, sources must have meaning. I asked you the other time to find out for me about the difference between primary and secondary sources.
Huh?
Yes, Esther, don't sleep. Can you tell me the difference between primary and secondary sources?
Okay, sir. I got it. A primary source dates back to the actual time when an event occurred. They are primary sources because they are based on what people saw, heard, or created at the time. Primary sources could take a variety of forms, including letters, documents, books, photographs, drawings and paintings, cartoons, speeches, monuments, print and electronic media, and so forth.
Great, my girl. Esther, can you give me the publishing date of your textbook?
It's 2015, sir.
Okay. Tell me, when did the German rule in Namibia come to an end?
That should be in 1915, sir.
You are correct. If you compare 2015 and 1915, what does it tell you?
It tells me that the textbook about German colonization was produced only after their rule ended. Most probably, the writer was not present during the events.
Now I can see that you are awake. Yes, your textbooks are examples of secondary sources. Secondary sources are usually, but not always, produced sometime after the event or period they describe. They tend to be based on primary sources of evidence or the findings of others.
Sir, I'm struggling to understand graphs, tables, and maps. Can you please explain it to me?
Yes, you must look at what information you give. You need to link it with historical events. For example, from which direction attack was launched will be indicated with arrows on a map. In which year did von Trotta succeeded Ludwig? In which year the Battle of Waterberg fought? Is it clear for you?
Thank you, sir. It's much clearer now. But what must we look at when it comes to written sources?
Written sources can include extracts from constitutions, speeches, letters, diary entries, books, etc. These have to be evaluated in terms of their reliability and bias, as well as ascertaining what information can be gained from them. Another important skill is the comparison and contrast of various documents. For example, eyewitnesses' accounts from various points of view. See if the source is biased, in other words, whether it presents one side of a picture only. Any difficulties for you?
I struggle with a question with two sources. If the sources differ or are they similar?
The basic aspect that you must know is that when there are two sources involved in a question, you must compare. First, the similarities and then the differences. Secondly, use support from the two sources to point out the similarities and the differences. Thirdly, you must use your contextual, it means your own knowledge. Your own knowledge is what you learned in the class about what the sources say. Fourthly, you must use cross-reference with other sources to support the sources you are dealing with.
What about a useful or reliable question with two or more sources, sir?
In this case, you consider each source reliable or useful and unreliable or less useful, etc. You need to balance in this case by showing the usefulness of the sources and less usefulness.
Oh, now I have a clear understanding. Thank you, sir.
All right. Listeners, we've learned things like you will usually be asked what the cartoonist's attitude is towards an event. For instance, what does the cartoonist think about what has happened? You need to look at cartoons very carefully. Which newspaper? This gives a clue to the attitude, for example, British, Namibian, Russian, USA. What writing there is on the cartoon, either the caption or information on the cartoon. The date, if this is not on the cartoon, it should be above it in the setting of the context. The examiners will give you the date, name, the figures in the cartoon, which tells you which event the cartoon refers to. The using of photographs. Although a photograph is usually taken by an eyewitness, you cannot be certain what the photograph is, accurate reflection of what happened. Photographers have purpose in mind when they take a photograph. You need to ask what that purpose was. Sometimes photographs are altered to improve the appearance of people. Parts of a photograph can be blocked out, or a photograph can even be fake.
The next question we ask is whether this is a reliable source. So here you have to ask yourself whether the source is accurate or whether it can be trusted. A source may be reliable for some purposes but unreliable for others. There are a number of questions that should be asked of the source before you can answer this question. This includes who produced the source and when? Is the source biased in any way? Was the person who created the source an eyewitness? Was the source created a long time after the event? Why was the source produced? Are there any factual errors? A cartoon may be unreliable in telling you the facts about an event at the time that it happened, and you need to use your own knowledge. These questions should not be asked very often, as the way in which you answer the questions will show whether or not you have a good knowledge of the period, for example, of the reasons for the Herero uprising in 1904. However, you may be asked to use the evidence in a source and your own knowledge to explain your answer, in which case you have the opportunity to show what you know about the event and to say what has not been covered by the sources. You need to also refer to the information in the sources.
Thank you very much. And that brings us to the end of today's presentation. From me, Ronald Krotz, the program developer, Jul van Harte, and the NAMCOL production crew. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, take care.
This program was brought to you by NAMCOL with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.
Hi there again, listeners and fellow learners. Welcome once again to our NAMCOL radio studio. My name is Ronald Krotz. Listeners, in lesson 5 today, we're going to talk about the skills of answering paper 1. For this lesson, you need to know and bear in mind that paper 1 has only 3 types of questions to answer, namely A, B, and C. Good morning, class. Who knows about the A question in paper 1?
Me! I know, sir.
All right. Can you tell us what question A is all about and give an example?
Sir, question A is the shortest question of all 3 questions and is straight to the point where one just needs to list or write points. For example, what were the terms of the Treaty of Versailles?
Good girl. This is exactly how question 1 looks like. When answering it, you do not need any explanations, but just write straight to the point. You can even list your points.
Do I answer the same in question B as well, sir?
Can I answer that question, sir?
Yes, of course. Off you go, girl.
I don't think you need to answer the same, Esther, because in question B, this is where you need explanations of the points or facts you are writing. So I think first you identify the points or the facts, and then only you explain them.
Exactly. Is your question answered, Esther?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Debbie.
Okay. Do you perhaps have something you would like to say, or is there something you don't understand?
I have one question, sir. I was just wondering if I can apply the same skills as question A and B to question C.
No, not at all. Every question has its own way of answering it. A C question, you should always first check what it's addressing and start answering it by balancing. Let's look at this question first. To what extent was the Treaty of Versailles fair? That's the question. How do you balance it? You should focus on the key word addressed in the question, which is fair, and identify the opposite word, which is unfair. Then, in your answer, you should address the fairness of the Treaty of Versailles and the unfairness of it.
Oh, thank you, sir. I think I got it now.
Now, you can apply all the answering skills in each question to each sections. Listeners, we have learned things like A question. You describe briefly, list points out, and so on. B question is description and explanation. C question, balance your answer by first answering what the question addresses and the other factors or other side. For the C question, where they ask about a point or a factor, identify other factors as well. For example, SWAPO was the only contributing factor to Namibian independence. How far do you agree? First, you should indicate if you agree or disagree, and then explain how SWAPO contributed to independence. You should identify other factors and how they contributed to the independence of Namibia. And with that, we have come to the end of today's presentation. From me, Ronald Krotz, a program developer, Yul van Harte, and the Namcol production crew, thanks again for listening. Until next time, take care.
This program was brought to you by Namcol with funding from the Ministry of Education, Arts and Culture and the Commonwealth of Learning.